he was responsible for it. So I think he was accorded that sense of, well, it's his show, he's in charge, and thus he sort of is to blame or to be trusted, as the case might be. One of the more interesting case studies is Lost. It's a very muddled bit of authorship that I think it's interesting to decode to just get a sense of the ways in which authorship is not straightforward, especially on shows like this. Every episode has this credit on it: created by Jeffrey Lieber and J.J. Abrams, and that second "and" is an ampersand, Damon Lindelof. And that ampersand, there's a significance between the ampersand and the written out word "and," which I'll explain in a minute. Now, none of these three people came up with the original idea for Lost. The original idea from Lost actually came from someone who is never mentioned in any of the credits for Lost. His name is Lloyd Braun, and he was an executive at ABC, the network that aired the show. Typically what happens in a network is different executives will come into an annual meeting amongst the network for ideas for shows. A lot of the shows come in from writers, so Joss Whedon will say, I have a new idea for a show, and they'll look at it. But the executives come up with their ideas themselves sometimes. And in this case, Lloyd Braun came up with an idea to do a show based on people stranded on a desert island. And he kind of had it because it was shortly after the film Castaway had come out with Tom Hanks, and the show Survivor was very popular as well. So there was a sense of, can we take some of the drama of the reality show Survivor and this film Castaway and create a serial TV show about it? Okay. Most of the other people thought it was kind of a silly idea, but he was really into it and he was in charge. So he hired a writer named Jeffrey Lieber to write a script based on this. So Jeffrey Lieber wrote 2 versions of the pilot. At that time it was called Nowhere. And Braun thought they weren't very good, so he fired Lieber off the project. But he still cared about the project, so he brought it to J.J. Abrams, who at the time was the showrunner for Alias, another ABC show, and he was pretty hot property in Hollywood at the time. And Abrams said that he was too busy to work on it directly, but Braun was his boss, and he didn't want to turn him down totally, so he said, well, if you bring me another writer to work on it, I'll give it a pass. So they brought in Damon Lindelof, and Lindelof came into the project because his agent had been trying to get Lindelof a meeting with J.J. Abrams because Lindelof was a big fan of Alias and wanted to get a job writing on Alias. Lindelof's agent connected him with Abrams. The two of them had a meeting. They got along really well, and they came up with this outline for this wacky show with these conspiracies and this mythology and these flashbacks and everything. And they came up with this idea with the full intent that this show would never get onto the air. Abrams was doing it because it was a favor to his boss, Lloyd Braun. Lindelof was doing it because he wanted a job writing on Alias, and he thought this was a way to get to know J.J. Abrams. And they both had heard the rumors that Lloyd Braun was going to be fired from ABC because ABC was not doing very well. They hadn't had a hit in a few years, and Lloyd Braun was to blame for this. So everyone thought Lloyd Braun was going to be fired. There's no way this show would be on air. So they purposely decided, let's create the craziest show we can imagine because there are no stakes. We don't care whether it gets on the air or not. And Braun loved it and greenlit the pilot. And not only greenlit the pilot, meaning financed the production of it, but at the time he greenlit the highest budget ever approved for a television pilot. Because, I mean, if you've seen the pilot, you know it's a big deal. It's shot on location in Hawaii. There's a giant plane crash that takes place in it. So there's a lot of, and there's a big cast, et cetera. So it had a record budget of over $11 million to shoot the pilot, and it was actually greenlit without even a script. What Abrams and Lindelof had produced for Braun was an outline of the story. It wasn't actually a script. And a lot of people claim the reason Braun greenlit this outlandishly expensive pilot was out of spite to his bosses who were about to fire him. And they did fire him, but they fired him late enough into the production process of Lost that they had sunk enough money into the production that they felt like they had to proceed. And because they liked Abrams, they didn't want to just cancel the show before it aired, so they went ahead and picked up the show. aired the pilot expecting it to be a giant bomb, and then, you know, they'd cancel it after a few episodes and then write the whole thing off as a sort of bad business arrangement with Lloyd Braun. As we now know, it was a hugely popular pilot, and the first season of Lost turned out to be a surprise hit. Again, no one intended this to happen in the way that we imagine authorship sort of intending. This is my vision for the show that I want to enact. It was a series of accidents. It was a series of accidents that that led to not only Abrams and Lindelof unintentionally created their biggest hit, and the reason why that ampersand is there is ampersand in credit means collaborative, whereas and means non-collaborative. And the reason why Jeffrey Lieber's name is on every episode of Lost, and he got money for every episode of Lost, even though his work did not factor at all into the production of Lost, was because the Writers Guild, the sort of union that oversees writers, arbitrates cases of sort of contested authorship. And they said he had done enough work on this show to warrant a writing credit, even though his work was not represented in the final product of the show. So he got a credit, and he got a lot of money for it, even though he wasn't actually a creator in any way that we would imagine an author being creator. Now, the interesting thing is that if you talk to most people, especially after the first couple seasons of Lost, people always refer to it as J.J. Abrams' Lost. But Abrams had very little involvement after the pilot. He was still working on Alias. He also wanted to go make the Mission Impossible 3 movie that he was signed on to make. So he told Lindelof, I can't stick with this show, you need to run it. Lindelof had never run a show before. He had definitely never attempted to manage something as complicated as Lost, both narratively and production-wise. So he kind of freaked out. Some of his stories about this are pretty funny. He desperately wanted the show to fail because he couldn't handle the pressure of the show was there. But he brought on his friend and old boss, Carlton Cuse, who he had worked with on a very forgettable TV show called Nash Bridges. And Cuse was brought in as co-showrunner. He had a lot more experience running a show. And Cuse and Lindelof became the showrunners from mid-season 1 onward. J.J. Abrams had almost no involvement whatsoever. And yet, in the popular imagination, Abrams' authorship role, I think, is elevated to a much higher level. Now, this points to the second dimension of authorship, the production of authorship, the way in which authorship is rhetorically circulates and is furthered in various ways. And it raises a question about, is commercial television authored at all? Or is it produced? And you think about these two different terms, and the implications of these terms, are significant. Authorship implies vision, originality, creativity. Produced implies a factory model of creating something, manufacturing something. And this obviously ties back to early critics of television that looked at television as part of mass culture, like Theodore Adorno and Dwight MacDonald, who really saw television as not a creative medium, but rather as a mass medium of production. Now, I don't want to try to sort of weigh in this debate in a way to say that they were right or wrong. I think that these two dimensions are always in play. The sort of pull between art and commerce is a huge pull within almost all television production. But what I'm interested in is the way in which television authors are rhetorically constructed, whether you believe that it's a situation of true authorship. But certainly, rhetorically, television authors are important. They circulate. And they circulate beyond the ways in which we normally think about authorship as the sort of originary moment of intent. Or in the case of film, we often think about auteur theory as suggesting a unity of style or theme. So the traditional notions are that authorship is sort of the place that we can look to for how the creative work comes to be and has a degree of unity. But given the highly collaborative and ongoing serial form of television, these are harder to sort of grapple with. And thus, I look more to the sort of writings of Michel Foucault, who suggests that authorship not be understood as the creator of the text, but rather that is something that texts create. And he uses the term the author function. And this is in dialogue with Roland Barthes, who claims the death of the author as an originary figure. But what Foucault argues, and I find very compelling, is that authorship is a function of discourse that works to attribute, classify, delimit, contextualize, hierarchize, and authenticate creative works. And I think that in recent years, American television has become more legitimated and acceptable in large part because the author function has become more prominent. So here are some of the ways that it has. And one is a question of attribution. So attributing a show to an author is hugely important rhetorically. This is Joss Whedon's news show. That's an important move. Commercially, it's important to draw fans, and it's important for critics as a way to frame their expectations. And it validates a show. And saying, okay, this is serious TV. It's from Aaron Sorkin. It's from J.J. Abrams. This is going to have a mark of quality that others don't. So it attributes and it classifies. The sense of, okay, a J.J. Abrams show, you have certain expectations about genre, about style, maybe about themes. And such branding often helps motivate viewers to stick with a show in hopes that it grows to match authors' previous work. So, example of Dollhouse, which is Joss Whedon's most recent television show. I think most fans found it very erratic, but they stuck with it because they trusted that Joss would deliver something to match Buffy and Angel and Firefly. And I think that this idea of classification and attribution and distinction of aesthetic hierarchies and values all play into the role of authorship as a legitimating force within a lot of television programming. And I think that authorship doesn't necessarily mean a sort of highbrow or artistic greatness, and it can often mean sort of a more of a run-of-the-mill style. So Chuck Lorre is an example of a TV author who's not seen as very distinctive. He's the sitcom creator of shows like 2.5 Men and Big Bang Theory and Mike and Molly, and a lot of shows that a lot of critics and fans see as fairly lowbrow, not particularly sophisticated television. But he has a certain authorial stamp. And fans and critics know that authorial stamp, and their expectations, both aesthetic and formal, are really triggered by that. So expectations can both help sort of frame what you want from a show, but also creates a burden. And I mentioned yesterday Treme, David Simon's show that followed The Wire. And I think that that's a show that really was burdened by the expectations. A lot of people wanted Treme to be The Wire Goes to New Orleans, and it's not. I mean, certainly you can look at the two and see that they are products of a similar sensibility and have many similarities in casting, in tone, and visual style. But there are a lot of things that are very, very different that a lot of fans, I think, were disappointed by Treme because it wasn't more like The Wire. And I think that the appreciation of the show and what the show does incredibly well was hurt by that authorial branding and expectations. And then finally, authorship can serve as a mode of authentication, a way to say that the expertise and experiences that a creator brings to the show makes their take legitimate. So The Wire is a really good example here. David Simon was well known as a crime reporter in Baltimore who'd spent 10 years covering Baltimore's drug and homicide crime divisions, and thus he had an authenticated perspective on these topics. And his co-producer on the show, Ed Burns, had 20 years as a homicide detective in Baltimore and had worked for 8 years as a public school teacher after that. So those experiences validated what we saw on the show and said these are real people coming from, who have a perspective on these topics and know what they're talking about. And that sense of authentication is crucial for a show like The Wire. Now, one of the ways that authorship has really shifted in recent years is, like I said,